Good evening and welcome. Bonsoir et bienvenue. My name is Alex Gates, and I'm the Executive Director and Curator of the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa, Ontario, which is situated on the ancestral lands and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of Skugat Island First Nation and the traditional territory of the Mississauga Nation. On behalf of everyone at the museum, I'm glad you're able to join us for this evening's Third Thursday talk as we share Canada's automotive heritage. It's now my pleasure to introduce our special guest for the evening. We are going to be hearing from Chief Michael Starr of the Star Blanket Cree Nation. He was responsible for bringing the headdress that was presented to Sam McLaughlin by Chief Red Dog that was formerly displayed at the Oshawa Public Library back to Saskatchewan from Ontario in 2008. And we'll be getting to that story in just a moment. We also have with us live Kim Goodfeather, who is the great-granddaughter of Mathew Lasuisse of the Standing Buffalo Dakota Nation, where she is actually a band counselor. She's one of the people, or I should say her great-grandfather was one of the people that Regina GM plant manager Harry Aughe exchanged letters with, and we'll also be hearing about that story as well this evening. Finally today, running our amazing slideshow and PowerPoint is put together by Dale Edward Johnson. He's an automotive journalist based in Regina, and he's written more than 1,000 car articles and columns for magazines, newspapers, radio, and websites. He regularly columns for the Regina Leader Post, Old Autos, and you might have seen his work in places like CAA Magazine, Collectible Automobile, High Performance Pontiac, and Old Cars Weekly. His articles have appeared across the country in the National Post, Ottawa Citizen, Toronto Star, Vancouver Sun, you name it. If it's automotive journalism, Dale Edward Johnson has been involved with it. And you might also recall he actually did another talk for us, one of our first talks actually in our Third Thursday series back early last year. He talked extensively on the GM Regina factory itself, and that's history. And this is actually a discussion that had spun off of that and additional research that he had done. So Dale, thank you for once again joining us as we're continuing to sort of unravel and learn more and more about GM and Regina, and tonight its relationship with local First Nations peoples, which is a topic we're all quite fascinated with. We've recently found some new documents and connections, and I'm looking forward to your presentation and the discussion we're going to have afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. Is everything looking good at your end? Okay, well, I want to tell you about this General Motors car factory in Regina, Saskatchewan, partly through the eyes of these two people, Sam McLaughlin, the president of GM Canada, and Harry Aughe, the first manager of the Regina GM plant. But first, I want to give you some background and context. If we go back about 100 years, Canada was booming in the 1920s. Cities were growing, society was changing. There were widespread new technologies like home appliances, radios, and movie theaters. And cars were certainly causing huge changes. While the Ford Model T may have put the world on wheels, by the 1920s, General Motors was overtaking the Ford Motor Company by offering more style and variety. General Motors was outgrowing its factory in Oshawa, Ontario, just outside of Toronto, and it needed another factory to keep up with demand. This man, Harry Aughe, was given the task of determining where the new plant should be built. Aughe had a lot of experience in the auto industry. He was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1883. He later joined the Chalmers Motor Company in Detroit and rose through the ranks. He was named treasurer in 1914. At the time, Chalmers was one of the top 10 automakers. He joined GM in Detroit in the early 1920s and later moved to GM Canada in Oshawa. Harry Aughe, an accountant by training, traveled throughout Western Canada looking for the best place for a second GM assembly plant. He decided Regina would be the best place for the plant. At the time, Regina had about 40,000 people. Edmonton and Calgary each had almost 80,000 people. Vancouver had a population of 150,000. Winnipeg was the major city in the West with about 200,000 people. Ford had opened an assembly plant in Winnipeg in 1916. But Harry Aughe recommended the plant be built in Regina for several reasons. First, Regina was very centrally located in the West. Cars made in Regina could easily be shipped by rail east to Manitoba and west to Alberta and BC. Another reason was the big population. Saskatchewan had almost 1 million people. Only Ontario and Quebec had more people. Alberta was second in the West, about 680,000 people, Manitoba 670,000, and then BC with 660,000. So building the plant in Regina meant being in the middle of the biggest market in the West. Also, Regina had a great supply of labor, farmers who were otherwise idle in the winter. Saskatchewan was very prosperous in the 1920s. It was a booming province and people had lots of money to spend on things like cars and trucks. Only one province, Ontario, had more vehicles. GM said it wanted to reward its very strong and loyal customer base in Saskatchewan by building a plant in Regina. On a per capita basis, automotive ownership was very high in Saskatchewan, the highest in Western Canada, and second only to Ontario. So there were several reasons why Regina made perfect sense for a new GM car factory. The deal between GM executives and City of Regina officials was finalized in May 1928. GM purchased 38 acres of land at $1,000 per acre from the City of Regina in the northeastern section of the city, north of 8th Avenue and west of Winnipeg Street. The announcement was made official on June 1st, 1928. Sam McLaughlin made the train trip to Regina for the official announcement. McLaughlin told the newspaper, "The West has always supported the McLaughlin Company and General Motors, its successor, in splendid fashion. We feel doubly happy, therefore, that by establishing an important plant in Regina, we can put back in payroll and local purchases some of the businesses which Western preference for our products has brought." Sam McLaughlin turned the sod for the start of construction and said he was optimistic about the prospects for the future growth of Western Canada. Harry Aughe stayed in Regina and was in charge of construction. It was a busy summer of 1928 putting up the facility. Harry Aughe hired the workers and saw the plant go up in just 5 months. When it was finished, it was the largest building in Regina. Meanwhile, Harry Aughe, his wife Lillian, and their 13-year-old daughter Janet settled into life in Regina. They moved to this home near the Saskatchewan legislature. Harry Aughe was profiled in the local newspaper, which said, "Of short stature, with fair hair, not as thin as he once was, wearing spectacles over twinkling eyes, and with a laugh as contagious as measles, Regina's newest resident has already made a host of friends in his brief sojourn here." Janet was close with both her father and her mother. The huge new plant opened on December 11, 1928, just 5 months after work began. There were jobs for 850 people. As well, related companies started up nearby, like a glass factory and a paint factory. An editorial in the Morning Leader said, "Everyone knows what the motor manufacturing industry has done for Oshawa, Ontario. Regina now becomes the Oshawa of the West and virtual headquarters of the automotive industry for the whole territory, extending from the Great Lakes to the Pacific coast." The Regina plant was expected to turn out about 30,000 vehicles a year. GM executives traveled from Oshawa for the official opening. There were also about a dozen people from the Star Blanket Cree Nation near Regina invited to the opening, including Chief Red Dog and his wife. Chief Red Dog's father was Chief Star Blanket and his grandfather was Chief White Buffalo Calf, who signed treaties in the 1870s. For the official opening, the guests from the Star Blanket Cree Nation were dressed in their traditional outfits. There was a teepee put up inside the plant. Trees in pots were also brought in. The opening of the GM plant in Regina was national news, and the Globe newspaper in Toronto reported how GM President Sam McLaughlin was made an honorary chief at the official opening. The Globe reported hundreds of Regina citizens who thronged the vast new industrial plant cheered and applauded as Chief Red Dog decked out Mr. McLaughlin with a green blanket, moccasins, and sweeping feathered headdress, which signified his acceptance into the tribe. Mr. McLaughlin's new name is Kichikaso Kinasko, which, when translated, means Chief Strong Arm. Chief Michael Starr of the Star Blanket Cree Nation is the grandson of a brother of Chief Red Dog. Chief Starr says, after the treaties were signed, there was what he calls a true connection of treating each other with mutual respect and understanding, and treating the ones who came over to our country when we signed the treaties like brothers and sisters. Chief Starr also says it was a rare honor for a First Nations leader to present a headdress to someone outside the First Nations community. Later in the day, there was a parade through downtown Regina to the Hotel Saskatchewan, where there was a public reception. When the Pontiac automobile was introduced in 1926, First Nations people were involved in the rollout in Canada, with people from the Six Nations near Brantford, Ontario, taking part, riding in a new Pontiac and wearing their traditional outfits. It was an interesting demonstration of the blend of the history of the people who were here before the settlers arrived and the future of technology, automobiles. The Pontiac automobile got its name from the community just outside Detroit, where they were first made. The town of Pontiac was named after a First Nations leader in the 1700s, Chief Pontiac. For marketing purposes, GM played up the fact that Pontiac was named after a First Nations leader. In early ads for Pontiacs, the tagline was Chief of the Sixes. For years, the hood ornament on Pontiacs was the head of a First Nations person. Print ads for Pontiacs often included images of First Nations people. GM used this connection into the 1950s. The Pontiac name was dropped in 2010. Soon after arriving in Regina, Harry Aughe developed friendships with First Nations people. Aughe was an avid photographer and often took pictures when he visited people at the Standing Buffalo Dakota Nation. Aughe was also an avid outdoorsman and enjoyed fishing. The First Nations people often showed him some great places for fishing and hunting. The bonds grew stronger, and Aughe took an interest in their communities. Sometimes after work, he would drive out to visit them, and they would exchange gifts. It was a busy time for Aughe, running the new GM complex for all of Western Canada. He was also involved in the community, including the Board of Trade, like today's Chamber of Commerce. His wife was also known for hosting tea parties at their home. Times were booming in the spring of 1929 as the cars rolled out of the huge new plant. But the Regina plant was open for less than a year when the stock market crashed in October 1929. As car sales dropped off, some of the workers were laid off in early 1930, and by August 1930, production was halted. In March 1931, the plant reopened, only to be shut down again a few months later. Harry Aughe was transferred back to Oshawa in the summer of 1931. He was sad about the move back east, saying, "No other 3 years of my life have I enjoyed more than those I have spent in Regina. I have a number of friends here that I regret to leave." He also hoped to return to Regina someday. He said, when conditions return to normal. The community held a farewell dinner at the Hotel Saskatchewan in his honor. An editorial said, "In his comparatively short residency here, Mr. Aughe has made his citizenship count." But Harry Aughe couldn't forget the people he had met in Saskatchewan. As well as photography being a hobby, Aughe was quite a letter writer, and that's how he kept up with the people he had met in Saskatchewan. In February 1932, Harry Aughe received a letter from Mathew Lasuisse. Lasuisse says, "We are all glad to hear from you. Well, all the old people are all in good health and well." He goes on to say, "Some people here are having hard times," and concludes, "I will always think of you, my best friend." Chief Red Dog of the Star Blanket Cree Nation wrote to Aughe in May 1932. Chief Red Dog said, "All are doing fine in the line of health, but being hard this year, we don't know how it would come out later. As money is so scarce, one has just enough to feed up 3 times a day. We are enjoying ourselves over the beautiful scenery outdoors again." He concludes by saying, "We all wish you good success and hoping to see you again in the near future, if God wills it. Yours, Chief Red Dog." The letters between Saskatchewan and Oshawa continued. Aughe stayed in touch with the people he had met when he lived in Regina from 1928 to 1931. In February 1933, Mathew Lasuisse wrote to Aughe and said, "I have received your letter here on February 3rd, and I was very glad to hear from you again. And also, I am glad that you have received the pipe in good order. I am still smoking your tobacco and also the food you gave me. Well, the people here are having hard times, and also we are having lots of snow. It's about 5 feet deep in some places in the bush." Harry Aughe sometimes traveled to Saskatchewan on business and always tried to work in a visit with his old friends. Lasuisse writes, "I would like to know what time you are coming. I could get a team and cutter to take you up to my place and back to town again. All the old people are very glad to hear that you are coming. A good handshake to you from Mathew Lasuisse." Chief Red Dog of Standing Buffalo sent Aughe a letter in January 1934. After talking about the cold weather and a big blizzard, Chief Red Dog expresses appreciation for their friendship, thanking Aughe for being so good to me, and adds, "Well, Mr. Aughe, you are the best friend I ever had, you and Chief McLaughlin, and I'll never forget you." Aughe continued to exchange letters with a number of people at Standing Buffalo and Star Blanket. In December 1934, Aughe received a letter from Jack Fisher, who said, "I got the calendar and the hockey pictures you sent me. I am thanking you for not forgetting us." In the spring of 1936 in Oshawa, Harry and Lillian's daughter Janet married Marley Harwood Black. The wedding made the women's pages of newspapers in both Regina and Oshawa. GM announced in the fall of 1937 that it would be reopening its Regina plant after extensive renovations to bring it up to date. However, Harry Aughe was not part of the reopening of the Regina plant. GM Vice President Harry Carmichael came to Regina for the reopening, and apparently it wasn't just business, with Carmichael saying, "We are not guided by the necessity for production facilities, but by a belief, right or wrong, that it is in the economic national welfare that we extend a helping hand to the Western provinces in their greatest time of need." The GM plant in Regina operated for 3 years, turning out Buicks, Chevrolet cars and trucks, Maple Leaf trucks, Oldsmobiles, and Pontiacs. In January 1938, Aughe got a letter from Mathew Lasuisse, who said, "I received your letter, and we are all glad to hear from you again. And also, I have received the tobacco and also the calendars and the cigarettes. We thank you ever so much for the kindness. We are having a lot of snow here. Well, that's all for now. So a good handshake to you. Sincerely, Mathew Lasuisse." Harry and Lillian soon left Oshawa and moved to Montreal, where he became a part owner of a General Motors dealership, North End Motors. The move also meant they were in the same city as their daughter and their son-in-law, but it turned out the retail car business wasn't to Harry Aughe's liking. A year later, Harry and Lillian moved to Brooklyn, New York, where he was treasurer of an industrial manufacturer, E.W. Bliss. Harry Aughe kept up with the people of Saskatchewan even after moving to New York. They continued to exchange gifts and letters. In this letter from the summer of 1940, Aughe writes to a shopkeeper in Fort Qu'Appelle to see about some seed potatoes Aughe wanted to buy for Mathew Lasuisse. Later in the summer of 1940 came the news that Chief Red Dog had died. In his will, he left his headdress to Sam McLaughlin. 12 years earlier, in 1928, Chief Red Dog had presented McLaughlin with a gift of a headdress at the opening ceremonies of the GM plant in Regina. The Leader Post newspaper said, "For his kindness to the Star Blanket Reserve, R.S. McLaughlin, president of General Motors of Canada, was willed the ornate headdress of Chief Red Dog, who passed on July 18th. In his will, Chief Red Dog emphasizes his headdress is to go to Chief McLaughlin, who has never forgotten the Star Blanket Reserve since he was made chief." Harry Aughe received another letter from Mathew Lasuisse in June 1941. Lasuisse thanks Aughe for the seed potatoes he picked up from the store. He says, "I got them planted and they are coming up good, so thank you ever so much." A couple of months later, Harry Aughe died of a heart attack. His death was news in Regina, with the Leader Post reporting, "Harry J. Aughe director of the Regina Board of Trade during the most active industrial development in the city's history, died suddenly on Sunday in Brooklyn, New York. Mr. Aughe was general manager of the General Motors Regina plant during the first production years from 1928 to the end of 1931. He was exceptionally active in the community life in Regina in those years. Mr. Aughe died suddenly while attending church service on Sunday morning. The funeral will be held Tuesday in Dayton, Ohio. Although Harry Aughe spent just 3 years of his career in Regina, his impact lasted far longer. His life could be an example for today's managers who are sent to a new community. Harry Aughe demonstrated how a leader can get involved in an adopted community beyond simply running the business. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the Regina GM plant was converted to a munitions factory and was renamed Regina Industries Limited. After the war, many people in Regina were hoping the factory would again be turning out cars and trucks. But GM never reopened the plant because production techniques had changed immensely during the war, and it no longer made sense to have regional factories. Meanwhile, Harry and Lillian's daughter, Janet, and her husband, Marley, were starting their family. Marley had a 39-year career with General Motors and worked in several countries. The family grew, 2 boys and a girl. The middle son, Peter Black, grew up in Montreal and has lived in Philadelphia for decades. He is the family historian, and he kept his father's letters and photographs. Without Peter's interest in his family's history, this presentation would not have been possible. A few years ago, Peter visited Regina for the first time, and he saw the GM plant that his grandfather ran in the late 20s and early 30s. The building that opened in 1928 as the home of General Motors in Regina is still standing, and it's home to a variety of businesses and organizations. The Regina GM plant is part of a display at the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa, including a Regina-made Chevrolet. The headdress that Chief Red Dog of Star Blanket left in his will to GM President Sam McLaughlin in 1940 was on display in Oshawa for decades. In 2017, it was returned to the Star Blanket Cree Nation. It's now on display at the First Nations University of Canada at the University of Regina. I would like to thank several people for making this presentation possible, including Peter Black in Milford, Pennsylvania, the Canadian Automotive Museum, the book Driving Force by Heather Robertson, the Globe and Mail newspaper, Library and Archives Canada, the Oshawa Public Library, Provincial Archives of Saskatchewan, the Regina Leader Post, and the Regina Public Library.
Joining us now is Chief Michael Starr of the Star Blanket Cree Nation near Belcarra, Saskatchewan. Chief Starr, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a bit, first of all, when the GM plant opened in 1928, what was the significance of Chief Red Dog presenting Sam McLaughlin with the headdress?
Our understanding is that our chief at that particular time, who was Chief Red Dog for sure, gifted Sam McLaughlin with the headdress just in honor of their friendship, in honor of their connection that they have, that they made, back in that time period. So our community was very honored to have that perspective as well when we found out that they were friends. So we, as a nation, we did some preliminary research, talking with different individuals. When the understanding came to our nation that the headdress was gifted to him.
So now there was another headdress in 1940 that Chief Red Dog left in his will to Sam McLaughlin. And so Sam McLaughlin then was gifted with another headdress in 1940, and it was on display in Ontario for several decades. But let's go back a few years, a little more recently, to when you found out this headdress was being returned to Saskatchewan. What was involved when you went to Oshawa in 2008 to be presented with this headdress?
Okay, yeah. First of all, when we found exactly what you indicated in terms of what what Chief Red Dog put in his will to gift his actual headdress, to his friend Sam McLaughlin, and we were very surprised, if you will, a little bit, because when you do such an honor, it's usually passed on to maybe your older relative or your family member, but we are as I said, a little bit surprised that he put it in there. So they must have had a really a very keen friendship, from our understanding, for him to do that. So yeah, it was I guess I'm not sure the history on where it traveled, if it just traveled to Regina, to where he was at. But our understanding that after he received it, it did make its way over to Oshawa. So maybe that's where he resided in his later part of his life. And so
in fact, this headdress was on display in Oshawa for decades. But then you found out that it was going to be returned back to Saskatchewan. Can you tell us about how that came about when you found out it was coming back and you went to Oshawa to be presented with the headdress?
Yes, no, absolutely. They reached out to us, the Oshawa, I think it was in their library museum, is my understanding. So they reached out to us, and when we heard that it was there, and they wanted to give it back to our community because it was, rightfully ours in a way. It was our ancestors' headdress from that perspective. So we were honored that they reached out to us. So, and absolutely, our current chief at that time was Chief Irvin Star Blanket, and I was a headman. I was a counselor at that time. So we journeyed down there in 2008 to retrieve it, and quite an exciting trip, because we didn't it was quite a long journey. We didn't want to take it on a plane, all those kind of things. So we decided to travel down there, and so we made it kind of like a family outing, if you will, to go all the way down there. It took us a few days to get there. And even finding Oshawa was kind of exciting in terms of how we did it. We're just kind of currently just getting used to Google Maps. We still had the old maps that we still use a little bit. So we're kind of just transitioning to in the time period. But nonetheless, we found it. The ladies there that helped us and wanted to re-gift us back the headdress, were very excited to meet us, and we were excited to meet them. And then when we saw it, it was just an emotional time for our chief at that time, and me as as a head person at that time, a council member, so excited to see that. So when we did receive it at that particular time, it was in a full bonnet, and then our chief at that time, he has worn headdresses, because that's what, as a chief, you have headdresses. So Oshawa Library were wondering how they are going to transport it back, to our home of Star Blanket. But when Irvin got it, he just kind of turned it, inside out, and how you're supposed to put it down, after you use it. So they were amazed in the how it came to be just in a small carrying case when we did bring it back. So it was quite the experience from that perspective. And then we did have a very what can you say, a ceremony, to bless it, and we did smudging over there outside. I remember being outside in the library, and there were a number of us from our family and a number from the Oshawa Library there, and so they witnessed us doing that that ceremony with the headdress. So yeah, it was quite an amazing experience, and a very exciting experience for us. So, yeah.
So then when it was back in Saskatchewan, when you returned home to Saskatchewan, what became of the headdress?
We, Chief Star Blanket, he carried it in his possession for a few years until his passing, and which wasn't long. He passed in 2009, and he was a very great leader in from that perspective, in Star Blanket's perspective, and I being on council at that time, he had kind of in his way, mentored me to take over in terms of the leadership for being a chief. So when our elections came in 2009, I assumed the position of chief, and have been chief since 2009, my commute to current date. So when the family in possession, who had the headdress in their possession, when he left, they gifted me his headdress along with Red Dog's headdress to care for it and take care of it. So I did it. I had it in my possession for a number of years. So yeah.
And did you ever use it at ceremonies?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. He always reminded me and always told me, you got to use it from time to time. You can't just let it, be resting all the time. So you got to bring it out and use it. So from time to time, that's what I would do. And I would use it in the ceremony of a grand entry in the most part. I seen him wearing it in the grand entry. He was very proud to wear it as well. When he, when in that time period that he had it, he used it from that perspective. So from time to time, I would bring it out and wear it at a grand entry. So yeah, so it was
now,
a very
in recent years, it's been on display. Can you tell us why it was decided to put this on display and where it's on display now?
Okay, we've been, we in the great institution, the Great Educational Institute, the First Nations University, we're in the process for a number of years to turn it into reserve creation. And throughout that time, in my mind, as being a leader, I wanted to give them with something significant on what it was, how the name of that reserve came to be. And in Cree, it's called a Tim Kumiposit. And in English, it's Red Dog. It's the Red Dog Reserve. That's what it's called. So, and it was after our last hereditary chief, who was Red Dog. And so, the significance I felt was because, the reserve was called Red Dog, that I would gift, his headdress to that institution. So it was an honor for me to gift them and see, I wanted it to be on display, at the First Nations University. This is why we named this beautiful institution after one of our past ancestors, our past leaders. So so it sits there. It's been sitting idle from because of what we're currently going through because of COVID. So it hasn't been used. So I was talking to one of our young elders. I wouldn't call him a young elder, but he's he works with our elders. He's a Waskopjus. That's what in Cree it's a helper, right? So I was just talking with him not long ago, and we said that we would go there and bless it, from our community's perspective. And he mentioned to us too, during that time when it was gifted to Sam, that there was probably songs related to that gift of that honor of that friendship of what they had. And absolutely, the truth and reconciliation, we talked about that too, and some of our elders talked about that too. And even inside treaty, there was always that peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, and having that understanding and working together side by side in true partnership. So, from that perspective, we came to that understanding. That was their friendship. That was how it was formed. They wanted to keep that going and keep that honor going. So, and having being in that industry when they became friends, we're assuming and we're thinking, they wanted to maybe look after our people that way. He wanted to look at, the livelihood of our people. They want to, and that's also in our treaty, keeping them busy, keeping them active in, employment opportunities. So that's how we think that their friendship occurred as well. And he saw that, that how it was tied together. And as you indicated, in terms of, what is that? The calls to action. Yeah, those kind of
the
things.
94 action points.
Yeah, those are kind of connected as well from that perspective. Though they weren't there yet, but from that perspective, it was there in a way from how they became friends, and from that perspective, our people of Star Blanket, they bestowed friends with all the white people in our surroundings. So there's friendships made in that regard too from our community. So we hold that in high regard, and when we make friends, we in our minds we keep that flowing, we keep that treaty flowing, we keep those honors of our ancestors flowing, with those making those friendships with our neighbors. So that's what I could add to say.
Among those 94 action points in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there are 3 that I thought really maybe tied into this story. When you look under business and reconciliation, one of them calls for respectful relationships. Another calls for ensuring that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs. And a third is to provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples. It seems that maybe this was happening 80 years ago, not under these titles, but what are your thoughts of how these points mentioned today actually were taking place in a way 80 or 90 years ago?
Yes, absolutely. It's kind of, I don't know, it's they are able to see, that future, visionary leaders as they were, from that perspective, and I'm thinking, we're thinking as a nation, that's part of it, that they knew at some point in history and time that, maybe that would come to the point where it might not be there, and things, how things were unfolding and things happening to our people, the hardships that were having to have, the hardships that were having being done to our people, they saw, that connection that still needed to be there. And in moving into the future, those are the things that they always kept in mind. They always wanted that partnership. They always made sure that they reached out to certain individuals, whether it be in the car industry or in any other industry that they felt that they needed to connect to. They did those kind of things. So yeah, absolutely, it was probably a visionary perspective. Not knowing the call to actions were eventually going to be here, they knew that at that particular time, and again from history's perspective, from the treaty's perspective, and how our ancestors wanted us to peaceful coincide and learn and to be brothers and to have friends with the newcomers that came over. From that perspective, I believe they had that friendship and learned to respect one another. Yeah, so I can add that. So yeah.
So then, just to sum up, what could we learn today about the relationship that Chief Red Dog and Sam McLaughlin had 80, 90 years ago?
Okay. It's just being good friends. Yeah, and that's, having friends and looking outside, our communities and finding that connection with an individual. We still need to do that. We still need to have those connections, and we still need to move that, that way, from that perspective of how they were friends and how they were friends together. The hardships that I talk about, the system that was upon us at that particular time, in terms of the residential schools, all those effects that are very hard on our people, and still today we are still feeling those effects. And it's very hard sometimes for the non-natives to understand the hardships that we went through, the hurt that we went through. But finding these stories and understanding them, that connections that they had at that particular time, I think we can learn from that. We can still have those friendships and still live together in peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, and have connections to businesses, and having that training opportunities for our people to move to and work together, and so that we can work together. So I often talk about a balance, of our ancestral ways, ceremonial ways, but also learning, things that are of value, and like how we need to move with the funding opportunities are there, the business opportunities are there. So those are the connections that we still have to apply and work with. And I believe their friendships and their connections, help that. That's from my understanding and how I saw their friendship over time. So yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for your time. Chief Michael Starr is the chief of the Star Blanket Cree Nation near Belcarris, Saskatchewan.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Great. So now we're going to have Kim Goodfeather join us, who is Chief Starr was unfortunately not able to join us live tonight, but it was very, very kind of him to do that pre-recorded session with Dale. But Kim, we're so lucky to have you tonight. I know you are very busy, but you are the great-granddaughter of one of the letter writers, of Mathew Lasuisse, whose letters we were just looking at. So, Dale, I know you have a few questions, so let's continue our dialogue.
All right. Kim, thanks for joining us. And I guess, first of all, what did it mean to you when you found out about these letters? Because that just came recently. When you found out about the letters and found out about the friendship between your great-grandfather and Harry Aughe.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to be present here tonight. I'm very honored to speak of my family's history and of my nation as well too. So when I first heard about these letters, it was through Peter Black. He had reached out to other people in my nation trying to find out who Mathew Lasuisse was. So that was how he and I made this connection, is with the last name Lasuisse and my family being Lasuisse. He was directed to me to make that connection. When Peter started sending me these letters, I read them, and it gave me such a huge sense of pride to be able to connect with the history of my family. I was very, very honored, but I was also very honored and had that pride because I was able to connect with my nation as well too, of how life was back in the 30s and 40s. The letters speak of life and how they had their struggles, but how they had their triumphs too as well. So with the letters, just gave me a sense of pride and a lot of honor to be able to connect with Peter and for him to present these letters to me.
Oh, Dale, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Kim, I wondered, why do you think your great-grandfather and Harry Aughe developed this friendship? And why do you think it lasted so long? I mean, literally to the end of Harry Aughe's life. He was still writing letters a decade later when he was in New York. Why do you think they had that friendship?
So I don't really have an understanding of how they made that first connection to become the friends that they did. But I could, from reading the letters and looking at them, I can see that they had a very strong connection. I believe Mr. Aughe had an interest in First Nations and wanting to know who we are and to know our nation of Standing Buffalo. He got to know quite a bit of people here. And with this friendship, I think it continued so long because it became more than just a friendship. They developed a family kinship with one another. And I can see that very clear in the letters when I read them. He gave a Dakota name to Mr. Aughe, and that name was Wambadi Tonka, which means great eagle. So he gave him that Dakota name to carry with him for the rest of his life. And his daughter, Janet, as well, she was presented with a name too, which was Winona, which in my language means the firstborn daughter of the family. So there was other people mentioned in the letters too that were given names, like a Mr. Van was Wakia Maza, which is like lightning, very strong lightning. So it started off as a friendship, but then from giving those Indian names, I believe it turned into a family kinship tie. So developing that family relation with one another. And I also read in the letter that Mr. Aughe was presented with a pipe. So for Dakota people and well as First Nations, all First Nations, the pipe holds a very sacred meaning to us. So to be gifted with a pipe, and from hearing Chief Star Blanket's interview, to be gifted with a headdress, those are great honors for us as First Nations people. So this is why I believe that that friendship turned into a family kinship for them. And the way they spoke to each other in the letters that I've read, and in one of the letters, my great-grandfather, Mathew, refers to his wife as Mama. So Mama says, hello, Mama, like those kind of things. So yeah, I think it was more than a friendship that they had. I think it was like a family tie that they developed.
What do you think we can learn today from this friendship of 80 years ago?
I think that your current friendships that you have now can carry through many generations and leave a great legacy for your future generations. And that's what this friendship did, is that it turned into something that they carried with themselves for those years, that they wrote those letters back and forth and presented each other with gifts, things like that. And I think irregardless of who you are, where you come from, what your status is, that a friendship can develop and turn into a very significant bond that can create bonds for future generations. The reason I say that is because with Peter, he and I still remain connected. My great-grandfather and his grandfather developed this bond, and now Peter and I have made this connection, and we are where they were years ago.
Kim, what else would you like to add about this part of your family's history?
I think I just want to say thank you to Peter for making this connection, and for, I guess, their friendship that they had long ago through the letter writing, through the picture sharing, things like that. Peter and I have that same connection, and that connection in our families still remains. And I'm going to always be grateful for Peter for this. It gave me so much information of my family history, so much information of my nation. It connected other family members in my family with our history of who we are and where we come from.
Perhaps we can take a few other questions. We just have a couple minutes left here in our talk this evening.
I can field one from the crowd. Cam would like to know, besides obviously the fairly strong personal connections and gifts sent back and forth, Mr. Johnson, do we know if there is any sort of did the GM plant specifically provide jobs to the local First Nations? Was there some kind of direct agreement of employment there other than the sort of higher treaty agreements?
We don't have any evidence of that, but there's a shortage of GM archival information about employees from 80 years ago, unless Kim has any information. But so we're not exactly sure how they developed this friendship, but I think the letters clearly indicate there was a friendship. So whether it was through meeting in the city or whether it was on his trips to fishing and hunting and visiting smaller towns in Saskatchewan like Fort Capel, somehow they got connected and somehow they had a very strong friendship, as we've seen. Kim, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't, not right now. Thank you.
Paula would like to know if there's anywhere where people can, because obviously we've seen quite a spectacular collection of, especially personal photographs. And I know that that's one thing at the Automotive Museum we're always looking for is more photos of Canadians and their cars and Canadians working on cars, and sort of personal snaps. But is there a way publicly people can see these photographs and some of these scanned letters? Are they being shared anywhere other than here, obviously?
Really just here, when I was in contact with Peter Black, he gave me permission to use these in presentations like this and in articles I've written for Old Autos, for example. So at this point, that's the only place where they've been shared because they're the property of Peter Black.
And I do have copies of all the letters and the photos too as well that he shared with me. And he did mail me one of the original letters that I do have.
So if anybody else has any more, I think we've probably got time for at least one or two more questions. So if you have questions or comments, please do type them in the Q&A box. Let us know, and I'll pass them along.
How many letters were there in total over the years? That's
I would think of the ones I went through. Now, Kim, you might have more, but I think I've seen probably about 25 or 30 letters. And as well as Mathew Lasuisse, there were also letters with other people like Jack Fisher and Chief Red Dog and some other people. But that's about the number I've seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's about the number I've seen too. And he did write, there was a couple letters in there, I believe, from Andy Lasuisse too, who is a brother to Mathew Lasuisse.
Do we know of any letters that survived from Sam McLaughlin that were exchanged, or other correspondence in terms of that relationship as well?
No, I have not seen any.
Yeah, I actually asked around in my nation from children of my great grandfathers, and there was no letters that we could find or locate as well either.
Now, even though we haven't seen any, it would still seem to me that there must have been some sort of correspondence between the opening ceremony in 1928 and then in 1940 leaving the headdress in your will. But so far we haven't seen those letters.
Well, maybe with talks like this, you never know. I mean, this started off with Dale's talk about a year ago. We talked about at that point some of these images, you know, and how uncomfortable we are, honestly, with not having real context behind them with some of these images that survived in public archives. But with more digging, it's become more of a real personal story, more than I think you know, a photo op that they clearly did at the opening of that GM factory back in Regina. But it was actually, you know, at least this personal relationship turned into something much deeper than, you know, that official opening ceremony back in the 1920s. And here we are almost 100 years later. And I couldn't be happier that that these relationships are coming together, and that we're discussing these things, and introducing a whole group of people this evening to this topic, and to your nation as well. So, just for clarification, where is Standing Buffalo Dakota Nation if we're out in Saskatchewan?
We are located in the southern part of Saskatchewan. We are actually, if you know where Regina, Saskatchewan is, we're about 45 minutes northeast of there. We're situated in the beautiful Coppell Valley.
So thank you once again, and I look forward to seeing all of our participants next month for our next talk. And Kim and Dale, I hope to stay in touch as we continue to talk about these topics. And being friends is important. I really love that takeaway these days. It's something that to really keep in mind, making these connections and keeping them. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.